You're listening to the Renegade Blitz podcast, a podcast for Steelers fans by Steelers fans. Follow us on Twitter at Renegade Blitz, read articles on renegadeblitz.com, and like us on Facebook. And we're back. We're back from hiatus and just in time for training camp. It's the Renegade Blitz. I'm Ty Polk, joined by Chris Ward. And Chris, I'm so excited, man. It feels like hope springs anew here. And I'm ready to say Steelers going to win the Super Bowl again because, you know, we're Steeler fans and we can't help it.
Yeah, it's starting to feel like football season now. The Steelers reported training camp yesterday on Wednesday, and then today they'll have their first practice at the UPMC Rooney Sports Complex, and then next week they'll be over at Heinz Field, and fans are allowed to attend. Also, they just it's free. They just have to do it through the mobile app.
It's going to be an exciting time, and you never know. Maybe you could see one of us down there, namely me, if I head down to training camp at Heinz Field.
You got to get out there for at least a couple practices.
I feel like I have to
on the weekend or something.
We'll see what I can do out there. But Chris, there's so much we could talk about in the last month since we've been away, and of course, we do understand there was a little bit of technical mishaps with getting out some of the podcasts. We were able to get it out on YouTube and eventually get the new podcast, the last one we made, on Spotify and Stitcher. We're currently working on the issues there. But in addition to that, there's so much we could talk about. What was Devin Bush doing is one of those things we could talk about. But of course, the Steelers also, David DeCastro now released. Just yesterday, Vince Williams retired. The Steelers signing Trey Turner and Melvin Ingram, two former Los Angeles Chargers. And, well, now I guess we can give a final grade on this offseason for the Steelers, because it seems like unless there's another move out there, there's still rumors about Steven Nelson and, of course, Malik Hooker. I can firmly say that for the absolute worst-case scenario that we had whenever we first talked about the Steelers offseason, all the way back maybe in May, something like that, it really ended up being not very fun for all of us, but I think they handled it the best they could.
Yeah, I had the Steelers going 7-10, so I don't, I have to reevaluate, and there's just been so many changes, especially the offensive line. That's really my biggest worry going into the season. The defense, we'll have to see. I like the Ingram signing. I think that, they desperately needed a number 3 outside linebacker. I just couldn't imagine going into the season, and if TJ Watt or Alex Highsmith got injured and we're out for a long period of time, they'll have to rely on Cassius Marsh and Quincy Roche. So, I mean, I think I really like the Ingram signing. If he could stay healthy, I think he could be really productive.
A Pro Bowler in 2017, 2018, and 2019, similar to Turner, in which they've had Pro Bowl seasons. But the one thing we have to ask right now is, what next for the Steelers? Is it secondary? Because they also signed an offensive lineman formerly of the Colts. Or do they go try to fill in that middle linebacker spot?
Yeah, I think they're going to have it play out a little bit in training camp to see what they have. They definitely could use probably like an extra inside linebacker with Williams retiring, maybe some safety depth. But the outside linebacker, that was really the big one. Cornerback, I think they're gonna see what they have at cornerback. I don't see them. I'll be surprised at least if they went out and got someone. I think the Nelson thing, I think that ship has sailed. I think I'll be really shocked if he came back.
Well, there's still questions to be answered, and we'll find out through this short, but now somehow, because of the Hall of Fame game, still 4-game preseason for the Steelers. And we'll talk more about that Hall of Fame weekend with our next guest. All right, so we're glad to have on Jim Wexell of Steel City Insider and the author of Polamalu. Jim, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, fellas.
And normally I start off the interviews with the first question, but Chris is so excited for the opportunity to talk to you about this book. As you see, he has a copy of Polamalu up right now.
For our listeners, if they see the video, great cover here of the Polamalu book. Jim, you mentioned in the book that it was over a decade in the making and includes interviews with hundreds of Polamalu's family, friends, coaches, team officials, front office members, and teammates. But Polamalu wasn't interviewed himself, as he didn't want to be interviewed about a book, about himself, which just shows how humble of a person Polamalu is. So how did the idea of writing a book on Polamalu start, and how difficult was it to put a biography together with the focal point of the story not being part of it?
Well, I interviewed him for like 12 years. I have a lot of Polamalu interview takes in the book, but nothing after his career where he sat down for like 3-4 days and went over his life. He didn't want to do that. He kept telling me to wait until he actually did something with his life. He's not too impressed with 2 rings and NFL Player of the Year and Hall of Fame. That doesn't impress him, like raising his children and being kind to his wife and feeding poor kids in Samoa, things like that. So how did it come about? I did a book tour in 2007. I did a tour of the nation, Steeler Nation, and I drove into Oregon and got to know everybody who raised Troy. And that's where the genesis of it. And the fact that he is going to be the only Hall of Famer from a defense that carried the Steelers to 3 Super Bowls in 6 years tells me that he was the guiding spirit of this team. And in the book, I called him the Holy Spirit of the locker room, the small, quiet voice of God who could do anything. And so pretty much that's the Troy idea.
And you talked about Troy's time growing up in Southern California and moving to Tamil, Oregon, a small town in the southwest of the state at the age of 9. So was it a complete change culturally and geographically from talking to Polamalu's family? And how did that adjustment go for him in his childhood?
Well, he loved it in the beginning because it was sunny, as he said, when he decided he wanted to live there. And then he got a taste of the Oregon winters. And by the time he was being recruited by Washington, he turned to his Uncle Kennedy and said, "Uncle, get me out of the rain." And that's when he returned to his more normal climes of Southern California before he came to rainy Pittsburgh. How was it different? Well, culturally, it was huge different. I don't know if you've ever been to Southern Oregon, but they used to have Klan parades on the main roads during football season. Brandon Polamalu told these stories, and there was quite a bit of racism against Samoans to that degree. And they had to, Salu, Uncle Salu, who raised them, who was a undefeated boxer in Samoa, left a trail of bodies often. And there's one story in the book where he was pulled over and pretty much hijacked by a group of angry white supremacists, and he left with them all laying on the road, and he drove away. And the stories became legend, and people began to leave the Polomalus alone, and they forged their own identity and drew a lot of love in the community. And Troy learned a lot, I believe, in that kind of culture shock for at least the family anyway. Southern Oregon wasn't the, they have gone to Seattle, and they've gone through California, the Samoan diaspora, if I'm pronouncing that word correctly. After the military bases in Samoa dried up in the 50s, they moved to Hawaii, and, they wanted to stay with jobs in the military and moved to California. And the Polamalu family moved to California, except Uncle Salu, the oldest brother of 11. He moved to Oregon to be with Shelley. Shelley had gone to Samoa. Shelley had gone to Hawaii and met Salu. These are the two that raised Salu and Shelley. And she went, like any normal person from Oregon would go to live in Hawaii and Samoa. And she met a Samoan, and she was hoping they would settle down there in that beautiful island. He wanted to go back to Oregon. So they went back to Oregon, and that's where they ended up raising Troy. Peaceful area, but a bit of a culture shock for the Samoans.
When Polamalu grew up in Southern California, one of the parts in the book that I really liked was him playing football with his brother and playing in the front lawn. And I guess you mentioned in different interviews that he had the same favorite player growing up. You were also a Walter Payton. That was your favorite player. So just share a little bit more on like growing up in Southern California. How was his childhood at that point of his life?
Well, he was, as he explained it, if you don't know that break-ins are wrong, you just do it every day. And he would, with his friends, they would, that's what they would do to hang out, break into places and hang out and do whatever 7, 8-year-old kids do. One time he talked about stealing someone's dog and then noticing that on the collar was a reward. So they brought the dog back and collected the reward. And as he explained, he didn't really know he was doing bad. He just didn't know. And he was always afraid of kidnappers, he said. And he had no parental supervision, and he would get a quarter, and he would go look for candy at 3 a.m. And walk down the median of the highway because he was afraid of the kidnappers. And he said he could always outrun them. And as his older uncle Al found out, he could outrun everybody, even when he was a little kid. His older brother Caio got involved with the Bloods and Crips. I believe he was in the Crips. And that got him kicked out of high school. And he was apparently a taller Troy, just as athletic, but taller. So when Troy reached 9 years old, the mom decided that this was not going to happen to Troy. So she had him bused to, they called it greyhounding. Actually, she drove him up. But and he stayed there, and he was raised until he went to Southern California on scholarship.
And then at Douglas High School in Oregon, Polamalu was a 3-sport athlete and was just so naturally gifted. You wrote in the book that he was a really good center fielder, and he played baseball at USC for a brief time. And he was there for the early days of Pete Carroll turning around the program into a real powerhouse. So how did Carroll really Carroll really knew how to utilize Polamalu's skill sets. He didn't recruit Polamalu, but how much of an impact did he have on Polamalu leading up to getting drafted by the Steelers in 2003?
It's funny. Troy always talks about with so much gratitude about I don't know if he used the word lucky, but the lucky breaks that happened to him. Pete Carroll Pete Carroll was a known defensive backs guru, ran camps. That's how Mike Tomlin met him. Mike Tomlin would always go to I don't know how famed it was, but I'm going to call it famed Pete Carroll DB's camp. That's where he got to meet Pete. And, Pete came to USC. Really, he was off the wall. It's like Mike Tomlin getting hired by the Steelers. Nobody knew where he came from. All of a sudden, the newspapers had their list of top candidates, the assistants. All of a sudden, Pete Carroll, who kind of flunked out of the NFL with the Patriots, becomes Troy's coach, replaces Paul Hackett. We in Pittsburgh know all about Paul Hackett. He's an offensive coordinator, deeply embroiled in his own brain, like a pro offensive coordinator. Really wasn't a college coach, as we found out at Pitt. And the change to Pete Carroll, I don't know, was lucky, or was it Troy Polamalu, full of meditative, reflective prayer, giving his entire body to God as service. God would do what he wished with Troy's body. And I would like to think that Troy manifested a great coach like Pete Carroll in the same way he suddenly manifested a great coach like Dick LeBeau in the pros when Tim Lewis was signed, sealed, ready to return as a coach, and for whatever reason decided to tell people he was going to get fired. And Dan Rooney didn't know what the heck he was talking about. And they called him in. Why are you telling people you're going to get fired? He said, aren't I? And they go, well, you are now. And that's when they brought in Dick LeBeau. I mean, every great break was not lucky for Troy. I mean, things happened to him. And they say you can manifest your own future. And I'd like to think that with Troy's clarity of mind and his prayers, that he manifested his future in this way with people like Pete Carroll and Dick LeBeau.
And Polamalu, during his Hall of Fame press conference last week, talked about how challenging his first season in Pittsburgh was, but also how it was humbling for him. He said that was his favorite season of his career because of the adversity he faced. And then in 2004 is when it really started to click for him, and it was also the year that LeBeau became the defensive coordinator. And again, as you mentioned earlier, he really was the perfect match for Polamalu, and he'll be presenting him in the Hall of Fame. So another Hall of Famer presenting a now a newly enshrined Hall of Famer. Can you talk a little bit more about that close relationship between the two?
Let me just throw this in there. His Hall of Fame speech is only going to be 6 to 8 minutes. So I wish he could answer your question. I will, but I think it's so absurd that this guy, a wealth of wisdom, and that's why I wrote this book, was for pretty much for kids, and all of us adults can learn from Polamalu too. The wisdom of Polamalu, how he overcame his early adversities, and how he learned, and how he made right decisions all the time, and the way he prayed, the way he meditated, all of that stuff is so important. And we're going to get 6 to 8 minutes. And it's going to take him 2 of those minutes to thank his high school coach. He's going to thank the whole world. That's how he is before he gets cut off. But I want to hear what this guy has to say, because he really didn't want to sit down and discuss his reflection with wisdom is what I want. And that's what I want to hear in his Hall of Fame speech. They moved him down from 1st to 10. Hopefully, because they can look around and see if they have extra time to let him just go on. Troy's really never been a guy to go on, but this is the time. Plan a speech and talk to us, Troy. I really want to know what's deep inside your heart. And he is an open-hearted guy, so this would be time for him to do so. Now, to answer your question, what did Dick LeBeau do for him? Dick LeBeau is just, he knew well enough to let him go, teach him the parameters, teach him the strict discipline of the defense, and then let him use all of his film study, his incredible clarity of mind, how he allowed God to direct his footsteps. At least he thought that way. And everywhere he was going on the field in a hurry with confidence, thinking that it was God's will. And that's how his mind was. And all the film he watched, if you remember the Mike Logan section talking about Troy watching offensive line tape. Troy, why are you doing this? Well, 5-6 years later, we see Troy diving over line because he can read offensive linemen so perfectly. I mean, he watched so much tape. That's why he never liked talking about football. He was just too immersed in it to talk about football in his free time. And to go with that clarity of mind, the confidence that came with God directing his footsteps, all the film he watched, and that 4.3 speed helped a little bit too. But Dick LeBeau was the puppeteer. He mastered it all and allowed Troy to play to his instincts, to see something. And Troy wasn't just a freelancer. As Troy joked at his Hall of Fame preview, the first time he dove over the line at the goal line, he told Casey, I'm sure he was joking, I told Casey to back up and play the deep third to cover my absence. Casey didn't listen. So, but that's how Troy, he'd make sure someone would cover his area as he wanted to make a play somewhere. So Dick LeBeau orchestrated all that and would tell other coaches, no, let's keep doing what we're doing here. Easy. Dick LeBeau would calm everyone and when need be, hype everybody, but he let Troy be Troy.
Yeah, it's just really amazing just how humble Polamalu is, just really a one-of-a-kind, player in person. But what was it like covering him during his career?
A lot of people didn't like talking to him because a lot of his answers were, a lot of the questions dealing with injuries were, will you play this week? And he'd say, God willing. And that became one of his favorite answers, God willing. And people would get frustrated. And I don't know whether Troy, I didn't ask those kind of questions. I got off injuries back when Yancey Thigpen had a hamstring problem, if you remember, back in 97. Every week, Yancey, how's it going? And after a while, he'd say, stop asking me about my hamstring because nobody knows about hamstrings until you go full speed. So I stopped asking them all. You still see reporters going around week by week basis on Fridays. How's this? How's that? Just leave these guys hate that question. So if you become that guy, and Troy probably saw a few of those guys, he would close up when you came around. So I always like to talk about college football, how his family's doing, how soccer, he loves soccer, and my kid played soccer and his kids played soccer. So we'd talk some soccer, and we'd get around to some football. And when I would ask questions, he would go beyond God willing many times. So we had a really good relationship, and he did call me for his retirement story, and I was honored by that. So how was it dealing with him? For me, it was great. There are guys that I'm not great with. I think of Chad Scott over in that corner. Chad Scott, he didn't like me at all. Fine. They're not all going to like you, but by the grace of God, Troy liked me, so I enjoyed talking to him all the time, and I tried my best to talk about other topics.
Yeah, and one of my favorite parts of the book is when you mentioned that Polamalu came to you and Randy Bauman of WDVE after the Super Bowl 43 post-game party, and you guys just had a regular conversation with each other. I thought that was really neat. Can you describe a little bit more of that interaction?
Well, let me just go here. I mean, what Randy said about the X's and O's, that really didn't interest me as much as it should have, and I can't remember. And Randy reviewed it in the book, and we talked about Larry Fitzgerald and the big play, and Troy asking, when did you guys think we were going to win this? But while Troy was talking to us and Randy was listening and nodding and paying attention, I was watching in the background. This beautiful woman was waiting, and she obviously wanted to talk to Troy. I mean, she was the prettiest woman outside of Troy's wife at the whole place. And she was dressed immaculately, looked really sweet. And when we were done, Troy looked at her and she said, "Oh, hi, Troy. I'm a big fan. I'm your greatest fan. And can I give you a hug?" And Troy said, "No." And I was, what, give her a hug. I'll give her a hug. Let me give her a hug. And she was shocked. Now, I don't think anyone had ever told her no in her entire life. And she said, "No, I just want a hug." And Troy said, "My heart belongs to another." And I'll never forget that. And I put that in, and some of the guys like Chris Hoke really loved that line. Some of the really staunch family men loved seeing a superstar as good looking as Troy and as well known as Troy behave that way about his wife. And I just thought it was beautiful. And I had heard Troy's 12-year-old son had commandeered the book I had sent to their home. And I was so glad about that part. A 12-year-old boy reading about his dad in that regard. And I want all 12-year-olds to read this book. So,
as mentioned before, there's so many great plays in Troy Polamalu's career. I mentioned that that jump over to snap. I think it was the one whenever he got Kerry Collins of the Tennessee Titans. There was another one at least out there. There's so many jump to snap moments he had. And, of course, that interception against San Diego in the playoffs, which he just basically just almost scooped it off the ground. So what is your personal favorite play out of Polamalu's career?
Well, Dick LeBeau's favorite is the one you just mentioned against San Diego, the scoop off the snow. I'll give you this one. Of course, the Flacco pick six, let's just look for other stuff that people don't know is the greatest play. The diving over the line, the last time he did it, they called him off sides. Everybody stopped. He hacked the quarterback's arm and picked up the fumble, and it was blown dead. Could have been a scoop and score. The old triple play by the player, sack, hack, and score. But it was blown dead, and I get in the locker room, and he was called offsides. And I get in the locker room, and I said, "Well, Troy, I knew it had to happen. You had to mistime one of those." And he goes, "Did I?" I go, "Well, yeah, everybody stopped play. Everybody knew you were over the line, and they blew it dead." And I said, "And you mistimed it." He goes, "Did I?" So I go home and I check it out, just frame by frame, really slowed it down. He was not offsides. He timed that thing so perfectly that it kind of looked offsides. That should have been a scoop and score and another play we all remember, but it was blown dead. That's one play. The other play, of course, we know the Carson Palmer play, but his first big play at the end of his rookie season, nobody was watching. 6-10 Steelers playing the 3-13 Chargers. Drew Brees had started the season at quarterback, young Drew Brees for the Chargers, replaced by Doug Flutie for 4 games. Brees gets a start late again against the Steelers, and it's a close game, and Troy comes off the edge and blows him up. He fumbles. The Steelers recover, scored a touchdown a play later. If they didn't score it on the recovery, but the touchdown either happened then or the next play. It was Troy's first sack, first forced fumble, first big play, and nobody remembers it. But what I noticed about it was Drew Brees went to the sideline and Marty Schottenheimer just chewed him out, reamed him up and down. And it was like 2 series later that Flutie was back in. And then at the end of the season, they drafted Phillip Rivers and the Steelers got Ben Roethlisberger. Now, it wasn't that big of a play in the season, but did Troy just give them Ben Roethlisberger on that moment? I mean, could that have actually been the biggest play that nobody knows about? So I wonder about that play at times.
I remember hearing from Chris Carter about how the Steelers potentially could have got Patrick Willis potentially if they lost a game against the Cincinnati Bengals in the season before he was drafted. Instead, they got Lawrence Timmons and everything worked out there. But it's just like you think about those plays in the future when they work out and when they don't work out.
Right. You never really know sometimes what the alternative would have been. Right.
And reading the book, it was amazing just how much Polamalu's teammates respected him, especially guys in the secondary like Ike Taylor, Ryan Clark, and Brian McFadden. You can feel the genuine excitement that they had in talking about him in the book. What was it like interviewing his teammates for the book?
Well, I had done it also for ever since Troy became a player. I had interviewed them and asked them choices. Some of that stuff came during his career, some after it. Ryan Clark was a must. That's one thing about Troy not sitting down for this. I had to work harder. And whereas Troy would have said, "Oh, that was all God's plan," Ryan Clark, when I finally did get a hold of him, I pursued him. I knew I needed him because you see how smart Ryan Clark is on his media work. And Ryan Clark, for instance, the Michael Vick play. When Troy ran down Michael Vick, I believe Mike threw a pass that was deflected back to him, and he caught it. And he was halfway around the edge when he caught it. And you know how fast Vick was. Well, Troy ran him down. And Ryan Clark explained the play. He gave us the genius behind Polamalu, where Troy would have never talked about that. Troy would have just credited God. Where Ryan talked about what actually happened and watching who he felt were the 2 greatest athletes in professional football, maybe in the world, had to go one-on-one, and Troy ran Vic down, and what a beautiful play. And that's just one example. What was it like interviewing those guys? I could have called Deshae too, and he would have said the same thing. Chris Hope did say the same thing. So the guys you mentioned weren't the only ones excited. They were just the only ones I called. Mike Logan, I was glad I called him. He had a lot of insight. He was the guy Troy eventually replaced. So he had no bitterness. He actually said Troy helped his life. It got him out of the troublemaking. Mike grew up around here. He grew up in McKeesport. He grew up in some of the tough neighborhoods. And he still had friends around that called him up after games, said, let's go out. And he would find himself in bad situations. And then Troy came along, and Mike Logan, 28, 29 years old, began following a 22-year-old the way of life that Troy taught him. And Mike said it saved his life. And so Mike had a lot of good things to say, and never bitter about losing his job to Polamalu.
So Polamalu said last week that he plans on returning to Heinz Field for a couple of games at least, and of course attend his Ring of Honor ceremony. He also said that his relationship with the Steelers is great. You wrote in the book that Polamalu still wanted to play at the time that he retired and was essentially forced out by Steelers brass. There was some speculation and rumors that Polamalu at the time wasn't on good terms with the Steelers. Was that ever true, or was it just Polamalu trying to separate himself from the game?
Well, I think there's both. He was miffed. There's no doubt about it. He didn't like the way and in the book I described how Mike Tomlin, Kevin Colbert, Art Rooney II kind of triple teamed him, tag teamed him in a meeting and tried to talk him into retiring. And they gave him a couple months to ponder how he wanted to do this. And the realization came to him. So he did make the decision. He could have probably gone on to play with Dick LeBeau with Tennessee, and I believe New England showed some interest. I think he could have continued. And he was still fast coming downhill. It was going backwards in coverage that was not working out so well for him. But he could come downhill with force. The other thing that bothered him, he was still ticked off about the 2011 contract negotiations when they told him after, I believe it was Timmons. I could be getting Timmons and Woodley mixed up, but they redid Timmons' contract, and Troy went in and said, hey, I want to be a Steeler my whole life. I'm the reigning defensive player of the year. When am I going to get extended? And they said, we're not going to extend any more, Troy. We're just out of money. We can't do it. A couple days later, they did Woodley. And then Troy stormed into the office, furious. And he was still upset about that. I don't know that his relationship with Art 2 was that good, but they did get the deal done. And Art, I believe it was Art's doing. Art went out of his way to mend the fences this past couple years. So a lot of what you're saying, there was some annoyance, ticked off, miffed. I don't want to say he was angry at the entire organization, because the second part of what you asked, he did move far, far away. He's raising his kids. And if you guys have kids playing youth sports, and especially at the level the Polamalu kids play at, he's a taxi cab service. And he believes in playing more than one sport. Luckily, his kids are blessed enough that they're that talented where coaches in other sports don't demand that they play summer ball, basketball, or whatever. Troy doesn't understand that some of us kids aren't that athletic, and they have to focus on one sport. And but he's getting a whiff of 3-4 sports at a time with 2 kids, taxi service, and it's all travel. So there's a lot of real life playing into him not wanting to come back to, and what he thinks of adulation and ceremony, you can imagine. Just to stand at center field and wave to everybody as they give him a standing ovation. That's just not Troy. But now that he's going into the Hall of Honor, and I'm sure he wants to bring his kids back to Pittsburgh, show them around and see all this. So he's all good now. And I don't think it was ever a hard grudge. But those things that I mentioned did annoy and miff him at the time.
And Jim, do you have a favorite chapter from the book, or are they all equal to you?
Well, I love the first chapter, Mike Miller's story. And what I do love about it is it set the entire organization up. His draft story about the mock draft night and then the trade up. Mike Miller was a quality control coach. His main job was getting the offensive coordinator coffee. And he loved the draft just like we nerds do. We make our mock drafts every day is a new mock draft. He had a ton of them, and he was the one. They had just told him, we're not trading up for Polamalu. So he went up and he traded up for Polamalu, and Cowher said, you are aware we just said we're not doing that. And Mike Miller said, I know, Coach, I'm sorry, but this is my chance to speak my mind. I don't get many chances here getting coffee for the offensive coordinator. So I'm sorry, but you just drafted the best player in the draft. And the people mocked Mike. But what Mike did, he set up the war room. He mentioned all the scouts, who the big wigs were, who sat at the main table. And this was in the 2003 draft. So Mike Miller's story not only set up the Polamalu trade up and explained it to us, it set up a decade long of dominance. How they did it, who was responsible, how Bill Cowher and Kevin Colbert took in information from everybody, how Dan Rooney, while in charge, was in and out, probably getting people coffee. That's how Dan Rooney is, so humble. And so Dan Rooney's in and out, not being the burdensome owner, meddlesome owner that a lot of teams have. And this set up Troy Polamalu, and then next year Ben Roethlisberger, now year after that Heath Miller, and now they've been joined by Tom Donahoe picks like Faneca, Aaron Smith, Hines Ward, and now you have, I don't know if they were a dynasty, but 3 Super Bowls in 6 years is kind of dynastic in my opinion, and that's what I love about that first chapter. It not only set up Polamalu, it set up the entire decade, and a lot of this book is about the Steelers of the aughts and how, there's a lot of stuff in there. Alan Faneca talking about how he's not warming up to play center in the Super Bowl. He's going to talk Jeff Hardings, and he's going to carry Jeff Hardings, and he's not leaving the game because I ain't playing center. That had nothing to do with Troy, but it was a good nugget. And I kept finding other nuggets about the Super Bowls and things like that. And so it's a mixed book of Polamalu and the Steelers of the aughts.
Yeah, and I know you guys at Steel City Insider and 24/7, you guys do a great job with the pre-draft coverage and scouting reports. What do you remember from Polamalu when he was coming out of USC?
Well, I remember the punt return, the hit he put on Lockett, and how he was supposed to be some kind of dirty player. And I thought, well, the Steelers aren't going to deal with dirty players. And then, they needed a safety, and they were looking at Dexter Jackson. And when they didn't get Dexter Jackson, we all kind of started digging into the safeties. So, and then there was a rumor, I believe Ed Bouchette broke the story. I don't even know if he remembers it, but I'm pretty sure it was Ed, that the Steelers were pondering trading up. It was a late. And so I reported that in a chat conference call with Tony Pauline, who's a great draft expert, and he was in on our conference call. I remember him laughing at me, saying they're going to trade up for Polamalu, and he was saying they might be able to get him where they're picking at 27. And so I just remember adamantly opposing him, but I remember at first thinking, Polamalu, the dirty player, the Steelers won't draft him. And then it comes out he's St. Troy, not a dirty player by any means. And so that's what I remember about that. And of course, he couldn't play in the bowl game. And by then, we were all starting to pay attention to who he was. So we wanted to get a look at him, and he didn't play. Brett Kiesel says in the book that he watched that game and liked how Polamalu was working the bicycle, trying to get that hamstring stretched to go into the game. And he remembered liking Polamalu's attitude and the fervor that he went at trying to get back in the game. Brett Kiesel remembered that, watching that. So that was pretty cool.
And Polamalu's former head coach, Bill Cowher, and teammate Alan Faneca will also be inducted into the Hall of Fame in a few weeks here. What was it like covering Cowher and Faneca during their careers?
Oh, Faneca was fantastic. But I do remember one moment wasn't so fantastic. And I only remember this because someone just brought it up to me. I visited a friend in Detroit, and he had a girlfriend who used to date that A.J. Przinsky, the catcher for the Chicago White Sox, if you remember. And so he brought up, and Przinsky one time in the playoffs, if you remember, against the California Angels, the catcher missed strike 3 and didn't tag Przinsky, and he kept walking to first base. And he walked slowly, and he got there, and they ruled him safe, and then they scored the winning run later. It should have been the third out. It was a big, big discussion at the time of whether, the catcher caught the ball. But when in question, catcher always tag runner, always tag batter for third strike. If you guys know baseball, that's a foundation. That's just taught to everybody when they're in Little League. Well, I was talking to another reporter, Mike Pursuta, and he had apparently bet on the Angels and was pretty miffed about that call. And I'm a White Sox fan, and he was talking about that play. I said, just tag the runner. And he goes, yeah, but he was safe. He caught the ball, tag the runner. He was safe. He caught the ball, tag the runner. And we're doing that. And I kept saying the same thing like a jerk. Alan Faneca turns around and goes, will you two shut up? Big red beat face. I mean, he was turned into his locker concentrating on practice. They had a tough practice that day. And he was trying to get ready. And he couldn't stand us two sports reporters just talking about baseball and arguing. So I remember that about Alan. The other things, Alan taking out 2-3 blockers at one time, and I would get him after a game. That Denver game in the playoffs, the AFC Championship game. I said, on Bettis' touchdown run, you took out 3 blockers with 1 block. And he'd be like, oh, that's just luck. Sometimes that happens. People trip into another. So he was always humble about that. But I know nowadays he's pretty proud of that 1 block. He pulled and knocked 3 people out of the way, and Bettis pretty much walked in for the touchdown. Bill Cowher, Bill Cowher and Mike Tomlin are completely different. By the end of Bill Cowher's career, he wasn't talking to any of us in the media. Couldn't stand any of us. We couldn't stand him. He was a kind of guy who walked around demanding perfection from secretaries, whomever in the building. And there's nothing wrong with being a Vince Lombardi type. And he won all the time. And then he won his Super Bowl. But that last year when he was fading into retirement, he just didn't want to have it with any of us. We were all tired of him. The support people were tired of him. He was, ogre's a strong word, but he was that kind of guy in the building. But that's the kind of stuff that worked for him. He had the entire building on their toes all the time. Nothing wrong with that. But he was a player's coach, don't get me wrong. But anybody that got in the way of his football, there was a grimace, maybe a scowl, and some harsh words at times. Mike Tomlin, you pass him in the hall, hey, Wex! And you walk away feeling uplifted. You want like, wow, does Mike want me to help get the practice stuff ready for him today? You want to help this guy. Let's go. Even if I'm a writer, but that's how Mike is. You see Mike, and one time Mike came over to the sideline to chew me out over something I wrote. He had a smile on his face the whole time. Nobody knew. He was just chewing my ass out. And he wanted my sources, and I wouldn't give them, and he was getting madder. But that smile remained, that positive energy. And I felt bad. I felt like I let him down. I didn't give my sources up. I felt like I let him down. And that's how he inspires you. They both work differently. And Bill Cowher, since then, we have a great relationship now, and he did apologize at one time for his bullish behavior, but it's all good. That's what coaches are supposed to do. And Mike Tomlin just has a different way of doing it, and he'll MF you with a smile on your face, with his face.
Going back a little bit, it's funny how you mentioned Troy was considered dirty in college, and then he was clean and squeaky clean in the NFL, and then you mentioned AJ Przinsky, who was about as dirty as it came in baseball. So yeah, but Donnie Shell and Bill Nunn are also members of this year's Hall of Fame. Well, the 2021 Hall of Fame class, of course, it is combined this year between 2020 and 2021 due to the coronavirus pandemic, and Shell had to wait a long time. He's so deserving. He's really it's really him and Nunn and maybe LC Greenwood, if he can eventually get in. They're the last beacons of the 70s Steelers. And Bill Nunn, of course, he's the trailblazer, opening the door for black players from HBCUs to the Steelers and across the NFL. How well do you know Shell? And of course, we heard about some memories of Bill Nunn with Ryan Scarpino, the former PR person for the Steelers. Just what are your memories of Nunn as well?
Oh man, Bill Nunn. Bill gave me an interview about how his relationship with Jackie Robinson, and I always wanted more from Bill Nunn. I wanted to do a book on Bill Nunn, and Bill, he was worse than Polamalu with the humility. No way, he was doing a book on scouting. He just thought he wasn't contributing as much as everybody was making a big deal out. Bill sat down for an interview. It was my first book. He talked about Jackie Robinson and scouting for the Steelers and the cutting of Dwayne Board, if you remember that. Bill was a camp manager. He had to tell people they were cutting. He told Dwayne Board he was cut, and they kept Dwight White, and Dwayne Board went on to a Pro Bowl career and Super Bowls too. But I remember Bill would just tell me about how scouting is you got to play the long game. You can't make final judgments just watching every now and then. And Bill was getting older, so he didn't remember all this. I mean, he told many people the same thing, so he wasn't sure he told me that in years past. On the first day of rookie camp, I'd always go up to him and say, all right, so who do you like? Who are the stars here? And he'd say, Jim, scouting, you got to play the long game. You got to have patience. And he would never tell me what he thought that day, because tomorrow's a new day. And he always had the open mind. Let these things grow. He would add to his knowledge base, but really he rarely had firm and final decisions. And you got to love the open mind. I mean, draft day did come and he had to take some people and make firm decisions then. But he was always have patience, watch. These are things you have to watch. And, I like talking to Bill because he was a sports writer too. That's how he started. So I like talking to him about sports writing, and I really miss him. And I really miss him now when I'm doing all these interviews with the other guys. I really wish that we could have a Bill Nunn interview. so we could get more from him. He never wanted to give too much because his mind was so open. He didn't want to have firm. He didn't live in the black and white world. Everything was gray. And that's how it is. There's always gray. And you have to take all of that into consideration before you make your black and white decision. So I'm going to miss that kind of wisdom. I've missed it for years now, and especially now at Hall of Fame time. And again, with the 6 to 8 minute speeches, it's just look. And Alan Faneca is another font of wisdom. I hesitate to say Bill Cowher because I've heard everything Bill Cowher's had to say, and he still has a platform on CBS when he wants to talk about an opinion. But guys like Faneca and Polamalu, I want to hear a lot from, and we're only going to get 6 to 8 minutes. It's just unfair. It's just, we've had to listen to a lot of crappy speeches. I was talking to Jack Lambert and this year, and I told him, I said, Jack, your Hall of Fame speech is still the greatest anyone has given. And he said, quit blowing smoke up my ass. He goes, why do you say that? And, you know the Jack Lambert speech, but the confidence with which he attacked the podium. I mean, I give speeches and I'm nervous as can be. I don't have that kind of confidence. But he stood there and he was crystal clear, and he had something he wanted to say, and he got to the end, and the crescendo rose of, you're damn well right, I'd do it again as a Pittsburgh Steeler, and the place erupts. And that was a nice long speech. That's what I want to see again from some of these great and wise Steelers who are getting in. Donnie Shell, I've interviewed him. I always want more from Donnie. I want more about Bill Nunn from him. I tried again this year. He answered someone else's question. He gave more information than he gave me at previous times. I always want more from Donnie. And Donnie gave a stat this year. His 51 interceptions. Okay, Dick LeBeau had 64. Mel Blount had 54. Donnie Shell had 51. Great. But when you say no strong safety has ever had 51. And then when Donnie gave that stat, he goes, that was back in the day when they averaged 13 passes a game. You can look it up. And I hadn't even thought about that. So 51 picks out of a guy who said he couldn't catch, and he had to work on his hands when he first got to camp. He worked with Swan and Stallworth. A guy who couldn't catch to have 51 picks as a strong safety, that's phenomenal. I think that stat got him into the Hall ahead of LC and Andy Russell. And to be honest, I think the next Steeler that's going to get all the attention and the work from Pittsburgh media and whoever promotes Hall of Famers, it's going to be Hines Ward. I think LC's going to be left in the past.
And Jim, in the book, you wrote that Polamalu's descended from a Samoan king, and you were quoted in the Pittsburgh Tribune Review that if you could ask Polamalu one question, it would be about his spirituality. What was it like learning about how important Polamalu's culture and faith are to him from talking with his family and friends?
That was a big surprise that he was. It wasn't just a king; it was the king. And that king had set up shop on a small remote island off the main island, well off the main island of Samoa. And that's that family, the entire Polamalu family. And that's part of the reason I just titled it Polamalu, because so many Polamalu relatives went into making Troy who he is. And they all deserve it. And that whole family goes back to descendant of the great king. I believe they called him, it's in the book, what this king's title was. And this king was supposed to have come from God. We all come from God, but apparently he was part of the mythology. But yeah, that was fun to learn. And then to get confirmation from Sean Nua, who grew up in that same village. And Sean Nua explained it all to me. You remember Sean Nua was a Steeler, but he grew up in that same little town. Sean Nua's dad is still the chief of that small town. But I thought all of that stuff was fantastic. I hope it was clear in the book. Some of it, I know all the Samoan verbiage and the names and the long titles can be confusing at times. I tried to make it as clear as possible. So I'm glad you got that he was from Kings. Yeah.
And then about his spirituality, what was that like learning from his family?
Well, that's one thing I said I want to learn more. The one great line that I love that resonates with a guy like me is the last thing Troy stole was a Bible in 6th grade. And he had said, God will forgive him for this. And so that was the last thing he stole. So that was pretty cool about spirituality. But I still want to know, and I want to do a book, Meditation in Sports. How did he meditate? How did he pray? We're all told to pray. You mumble a few names and you say, I hope they're good. Amen. How do you pray, Troy? How did you do it? How did you meditate? What times do you do it? What's the key? You manifested Dick LeBeau. You manifested Pete Carroll. You manifested 2 rings. It's not like you tried to, but how did you do all this? What did you do? Spell this out for all of us heathens. So that's what I want to know more from Troy about. And that's kind of what I want to hear in his Hall of Fame speech, some of that, but I know we're not going to be able to.
And that's Jim Wexell of Steel City Insider, 24/7 Sports, and the author of Polamalu. Jim, appreciate the insight on Troy Polamalu and the rest of this Steelers Hall of Fame class. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, guys. That was a fantastic interview. It really was. You guys asked a lot of good questions. I appreciate it.
Well, Chris, this was the interview that you wanted. So I imagine you enjoyed this opportunity with Jim to talk a little bit more about Steelers history.
Yeah, I read this book back in the wintertime, and just fantastic read. I highly recommend all Steeler fans to read this book, just because Polamalu is just a classic Steeler and just really embodied all of what it means to be a professional athlete and a Steeler. I'm just amazed by his humbleness, and I'm like Jim. I'm really looking forward to hearing his Hall of Fame speech.
And we've had 2 authors now on the podcast. Of course, our professor back at Point Park, Andrew Conti, who wrote the book on Bill Nunn and highlighting some of that time in the 70s for the Steelers, picking up all the great players that we know. So naturally, we're trying to get the author for Bill Cowher's book, Michael Hawley, out on there. So please help us out with that one, because we really want to create a Steelers book club. We want to do it a little bit differently compared to other podcasts out there.
There hasn't been one Steeler book that I read that was like, it wasn't good or whatever. It wasn't interesting. I mean, I just find them all interesting. And, Jim's book is definitely one of the best ones out there.
Be sure to pick up Polamalu wherever you can find books at. And that's all for us. For Chris Ward, I'm Ty Polk. Thank you for tuning in to the Renegade Blitz. Thank you for listening to the Renegade Blitz podcast. Follow us on Twitter at Renegade Blitz, read articles on renegadeblitz.com, and like us on Facebook. Our podcast is available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, YouTube, iHeart, and Spotify.